It's a privilege for me to be able to introduce Colonel Jebb to you. She's in a position now that I occupied for many years. One of a little handful, there are now 26 statutory professors at West Point, a very sought-after position. They give not only the leadership to the various departments, but they also give the continuity of leadership to the overall academy, because superintendents and commandants and other faculty come and go. So the fact that U.S. News and World Report, when it ranked, I think it was over 600 American colleges and universities in terms of their worthwhileness, ranked West Point as #1 as a teaching institution, and that's thanks to Colonel Jebb and a handful of colleagues. Originally in the military intelligence field, Colonel Jebb graduated from the military academy and then had her master's and doctorates in political science from Duke University. Additionally, had received a master's degree from the Naval War College. She had numerous command and staff assignments in the United States and abroad, and has authored or co-authored a number of books and articles in the field of international affairs. She's been teaching in the fields of comparative politics, cultural anthropology, international security, and a raft of terrorism and counterterrorism courses. So she's eminently qualified tonight to kick off this conference, and it's a privilege now to introduce Colonel Jebb.
Humbled and honored to be here, and sir, thank you for your gracious comments. I want to thank you particularly for leading the Department of Social Sciences with such clarity of vision, intellect, and compassion, with always the focus on cadet and faculty development. Being a soldier, scholar, statesman yourself, you've left really a cherished legacy in the department. My niece, Suzanne Nielsen, is here. There you go, Suzanne. And the faculty all strive every day to emulate your example, but thank you very, very much. And it's wonderful to be here for this conference, especially in the great state of Utah. I was remarking to somebody, this is my second time here. I probably should mention that I was here back in 1976 as part of my family's, we were celebrating the bicentennial. We drove across country. I remember stopping in Salt Lake City. So it's wonderful to be back. I have to tell you that we had just left New York. Suzanne, myself, and then Josh, I guess he left a few days ago. It's 70 degrees. We have not dealt with snow, ice. If this is global warming, we like it. Pretty good. Now, I also want to thank, and I know it takes a lot to put on a conference such as this, so I'd like to thank Richard Williams, Emily Reynolds, and Laura Solomon. I'm trying to find where you all are, and Abe Collier. But thank you very much for all that you've done. As I thought about what I wanted to share, I realized that my own thoughts on this topic have evolved. My introduction into this realm of human security really began with a trip to Djibouti, where I was looking at the civil affairs efforts there, and subsequent research in Chad, Niger, and Iraq and Afghanistan. And last year I was asked to give a talk on best practices of peacekeeping and counterterrorism in Jakarta. And it reminded me that though Clausewitz's basic premise that war is a continuation of politics by other means remains a choice of action at the disposal of states, it's also the case that war can be the remedy of only a few of the security challenges in today's world. Thus, notwithstanding Clausewitz's enduring principle, we really do need a more comprehensive security paradigm that will help guide us through our own national security in a very dangerous world. So I found myself using human security as a means to understand how to integrate not just counterterrorism, but operations across the spectrum so as to best focus efforts on a commonly understood purpose. So two major points that I'd like you to consider as we have an exchange today. First, how do we nurture strategic thinking? I don't necessarily mean how do we produce strategies, but how do we nurture strategic thinking, and that is thinking that is holistic, critical, creative, systematic, empathetic, and forward-leaning. And not just for the military, but across the government, the private sector, among host nation and allied partners. And this type of thinking really needs to start early, so I really applaud what you're doing here with this conference and getting everybody together. Second, how do we make sure that we do not lose the hard-earned lessons of the past decade? We were talking at lunch earlier. The past 10 years have been really tough. Been really tough on the military particularly. And this concern really motivates the second half of my talk. It's unfortunate that the Army had to relearn counterinsurgency. If you think about it, after Vietnam, we were so distraught about Vietnam, we didn't want to fight another Vietnam. So we squelched all what we learned about counterinsurgency, especially from the Army and its doctrine. And now that the country, we were talking earlier at dinner, is perhaps a little bit fatigued in the military from Iraq and Afghanistan, how do we ensure that we do not lose all that we have learned? And you'll hear calls for the military to just focus on conventional warfighting and get out of the non-lethal aspects of conflict. And so it was sobering. So you will appreciate this. The first senior conference was in 1963. And we do two conferences in the Department of Social Sciences for West Point. One the student conference that Gerald Jordan talked about. And we do another one for senior practitioners, academics, and policymakers. In 1963, the name of the conference was the West Point Conference on New Nations and Their Internal Defense. We could have just changed the date and put 2012. So I thought I would share some of my observations and thoughts as they've evolved, especially as the Army has been engaged this past decade in the war on terror. So to begin, I want to acknowledge a common starting point, some definitions and concepts. So the first part of my talk, I'm going to do just that. I'm going to unpack some key terms that you hear consistently. And then I'm going to turn to human security, which provides, I think, a lens, and that's how I look at it. So a conceptual lens, but I think it's required for better understanding threats, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. And most importantly, I think this framework helps us resist the temptation to reduce our thinking to binary dyads, right, such as we, they, military, non-military, counterterrorism, peacekeeping. And while the world appears much simpler when viewed in such a binary manner, it causes us to miss important dynamics. And finally, I'll devote the last portion of my talk specifically to the military, providing a set of guiding principles using or informed by a human security framework. So I need to do a disclaimer. When the military goes out and speaks, we normally say things like, the remarks I'm about to make do not reflect the views or opinions of the Department of Defense, the Army, West Point, Department of Social Sciences, my mom. It's all me, okay, so what I'm about to share with you. So I have a few minutes to cover really a lot of material, and I hope we'll get to a lot of this really in the Q&A, and we'll have a conversation. But I would like to begin by exploring some of the concepts embedded in our national security strategy, such as democracy, legitimacy, and terrorism. And in the spirit of Clausewitz, understanding that war is a continuation of politics, democracy has been at the forefront of how we think about, articulate, and craft strategy. In fact, the most recent U.S. national security strategy states, the United States supports the expansion of democracy and human rights abroad because governments that respect these values are more just, peaceful, and legitimate. We also do so because their success abroad fosters an environment that supports America's national interests. Of course, democracy means many things to many different people. Many theorists and political scientists highlight the importance of the culture of democracy. Gabriel Ammon and Sidney Verba discuss societal virtues that form the foundation for democracy, those virtues being trust, tolerance of diversity, competence of an empowered citizenry to affect politics, and allegiance towards the regime. Larry Diamond emphasizes that the quality of democracy also depends on its level of freedom, pluralism, justice, and accountability. But I would ask, is democracy necessary as long as you have legitimate functioning states? And of course, Sammy Huntington questioned the importance of the nature of the regime back in 1968 when he wrote, "The most important political distinction among country concerns not their form of government, but their degree of government." Meanwhile, Fareed Zakaria warns us that democratic transitions are most dangerous when he wrote in 1997 that far from being a temporal stage or a temporary stage, it appears that many countries are settling into a form of government that mixes a substantial degree of democracy with a substantial degree of illiberalism. And he writes, and I think it was very interesting, at the end of the article, he writes, "As we approach the next century, our task is to make democracy safe for the world." And Amartya Sen goes on to say that freedom is instrumental for development. In fact, he says, "Development is indeed a momentous engagement with freedom's possibilities." So what is all these ideas, from national security strategies to democratic theorists and economists, what does that all mean? And I think it really means that there are risks that must be understood and acknowledged so that policymakers may be able to decide if the risks are unacceptable or take the necessary steps to mitigate those risks. And these same policymakers must then shoulder the burden of these risks. So now let's shift a little bit to the problem of terrorism. Again, our national security explains how the United States is waging a global campaign against Al-Qaeda and its terrorist affiliates. The Princeton Project refers to terrorism as a global insurgency with a criminal core that should be addressed by a counterinsurgency that utilizes a range of tools. And Martha Crenshaw noted that concrete grievances and the lack of opportunity for political participation are among the causes of terrorism. And I think these ideas are important for two main reasons. First, they highlight the crisis of legitimacy found in many parts of the world, where people are also suffering from grave human insecurities. And second, they suggest that terrorism is not merely a military problem, but one that must be addressed primarily with non-military means. So how should the members of the international community address terrorism? And how do policymakers know which terrorist organizations to address and how best to address them? And while we might agree that groups that target innocent civilians are terrorists, we might also agree to note that their political motivations may have roots in real grievances. And this is not to say that real grievances justify indiscriminate violence, but it does provide some space to make real gains to either delegitimize terrorist groups or legitimize state actions that address real grievances. So the first step, I think, in understanding the contextual basis of legitimacy is understanding security from the individual's point of view. This human security perspective opens up the security aperture in very important ways. When the UN just a few years ago presented aggregate data, and I'll just give you some figures, such as 1 billion people who lack access to clean water, or 2 billion people who lack access to clean sanitation, or 3 million people who die from water-related diseases, or 14 million who die from hunger annually, and I can go on and on. It primarily described and reflected myriad human insecurities and the global gap between the haves and the have-nots. And while there are some commonalities among underdeveloped regions, they are far from all alike. One commonality, however, is that many of these transnational forces are directly harmful to people. They do not recognize borders and are particularly harmful to susceptible regions that are already suffering. Human security is a concept that both describes these conditions and provides an approach to better understand their effects. And I think in the conference material I saw that you were already looking at the UN document back in 1994 that said the concept of security has far too long been interpreted narrowly. Forgotten were the legitimate concerns of ordinary people who sought security in their daily lives. Clearly, not all areas face the same insecurities or combination of insecurities that the UNDP categorizes in terms of economic, food, and all the roundtables that Laura just had mentioned earlier, food and personal and community, etc. As we've witnessed in our increasing global world, these insecurities frequently have diffuse global effects such as migrations, reverberations in diaspora communities, environmental impacts, and even the exportation of terrorism. The human security paradigm reminds us to approach issues holistically and empathetically with painstaking analysis, patience, and tenacity. It's imperative that we do that to reach an understanding of what realistic outcomes might be, and understanding trade-offs and risks and possible opportunities. So I mentioned the Sahel earlier. What does this all have to do with the Sahel? It's interesting. I started this little, I didn't know I was going to go on a research agenda of human security until I got to Djibouti, and a colleague and I wrote up a paper and presented at a conference, and we talked about the military addressing these insecurities in Djibouti and the Horn of Africa. In the conference, and this was in, by the way, where's Rob? Was in the conference in Hawaii. They were in Hawaii, and people were very distressed that the military was doing that. So we decided, oh, let's go to another area. Let's talk to the folks in the field. And then we went to Chad and Niger. And it was an interesting look at an area that was experimenting with democracy, faced with terrorism, but primarily facing grave human insecurities that put tremendous stress on the state. Let me talk a little bit about Niger and Chad. Niger, by the way, is 3 times the size of California. Chad is twice the size of Texas. They face crises of legitimacy and state capacity. They're in a very dangerous neighborhood. They did not follow the Westphalian path of state-making. They entered the international system late, the latter half of the 20th century. They gained legitimacy from the outside rather from within. They exist with porous borders, and they present very vulnerable populations who suffer many of the human insecurities I just described. Let me give you a glimpse of what we saw there, looking, again, trying to look at it through the human security paradigm from an environmental perspective. There's, by the way, some of my colleagues when we did this were climatologists, so I have some climatology verbiage here. But there's good scientific research to believe that desertification of Sahel is going to continue and at a rapid pace. And desertification specifically refers to land degradation in dryland regions or the permanent decline in the potential of the land to support biological activity and hence human welfare. What does this mean? It means that an increase in temperature over the next 90 years that is forecasted, by the way, to be anywhere from an increase from 1.8 degrees Celsius to 4.9 degrees means that for every 1 degree causes a corresponding decrease in rainfall by 6%. In other words, by the turn of the century, there could be a 10 to 30% decrease of rainfall. And this decrease does not include all the anthropogenic forces such as overgrazing, deforestation, unsustainable agricultural practices. And these environmental impacts have impacts in other areas of survival, whether it's food, health. You think about a way of life. It was interesting. I talked to a gentleman who was the president of a human rights NGO in Niger, and he happened to be from the Tuareg ethnic group, which is a nomadic, WW, but it's a nomadic tribe ethnic group. And he basically said, look, the days of the nomads are coming to an end. I mean, we're going to have to change the way we live our lives, a change of culture. By the way, most folks I talked to said that it's scarcity, this land scarcity right now in the Sahel, that is really a source of conflict rather than religion and ethnicity. In Niger, it was interesting. I went to Niger after the famine / I'll call it food crisis. It was very, very interesting that nobody was allowed to use the word famine. Both host nation people, NGOs, the UN, and the reason why they weren't allowed to use the word famine is because that suggests that the government couldn't feed its people. And when you think about the United States, when we remember a tough time, we use the date, right? 9/11, we all know what that is. In Niger, the way they remember tough times is by the president's name. It would have been the Tanja period. So no one was allowed to use the word famine. So what's the difference? According to one official, a famine reflects people and livestock dying of hunger, while a food crisis describes a condition where food reserves are empty and widespread malnutrition exists. So what happened? There were all kinds of explanations. For many, they said it was not really a matter of food not being available, but it was not being available to people who couldn't afford it. So in other words, food was coming in, it was drifting south into Nigeria, and then it was being resold to people who couldn't afford to buy the food. It's very hard to measure the effects when you start thinking about all the second and third order effects of such a situation. Malnourished or chronic hunger leaves people susceptible to disease. Siblings are left home when moms are taking their kids to a treatment center. When large numbers of sick children come to a treatment center, there's a rise of infection. There's a cultural impact. John Wheatley, an anthropologist, had said that food systems are cultural mechanisms for meeting basic nutritional needs. And when coping mechanisms are not working, for whatever reason, then there's potential for even more widespread famine and other cultural dislocations. On top of this, you have a growing population. It was interesting, I met a gentleman who was just coming in as part of USAID, and he had said he had been there in the 1970s. And I thought, huh, so what strikes you? What's really different between the 1970s and what you're seeing now? He said, well, back then, Niamey, which is the capital, had 100,000 people, and we couldn't feed everybody. Now there's 1 million. He says, I don't know how we're going to do it. There's also, with human insecurities, cross-border issues. There's a phrase when Nigeria catches a cold, Niger sneezes. It was interesting, in the, as you know, in northern Nigeria, there's some radicalization going on. It's seeping a little bit into the south. And actually, women were being told, don't let your kids get vaccinated because it's really a plot to sterilize your kids from the West. So you have this terrible tragedy where vaccinations are available and kids are still being crippled by diseases that should be preventable. In Chad, of course, there was a spillover from the Darfur crisis and what was going on there. There were actually 250,000 refugees who poured into the East Chad as a result of what was going on in Darfur. And again, trying to think through the second, third order effects, the refugee camps, if you looked at them, didn't look too different from the eastern Chadian villages, right? So now you're in eastern Chad, you're in a village, 20,000 people just plop down next to you, and now you're competing for the same scarce resources, water, firewood, these types of things. And of course, within the refugee camps, what do you do with people all day in camps, right? The women were going out to get firewood, they were being assaulted, and then they had to have guards. What do you do with children all day in refugee camps? It's a lost generation. You got to make sure that they receive education. Just unbelievable challenges, just unbelievable. So at the end of the day, is there a terrorism threat in Chad, in Niger? And according to the International Crisis Group, it said that Sahel is not a hotbed of terrorist activity. A misconceived and heavy-handed approach can tip the scale in the wrong way. And when we were researching, there was much talk about the Salafist group for preaching in combat, which has origins in Algeria, and actually did have a firefight with the Chadian army. But I think what's critical to understand is that terrorism is not monolithic, and it's critical to understand what's happening on the ground. And it's very hard to sort out what's the difference between terrorist attacks and bandits and smuggling, etc. And I'm not trying to discount that there's terrorism in this area, especially after Iraq, when you have foreign fighters coming back, having been radicalized there, just like in Afghanistan in the 1980s. For many scholars talk about the fact that the jihadist ideology was globalized because of what was going on in the 80s in Afghanistan. So what is the way ahead? I'll just give you briefly, because I'm going to cover this again. One of the things that we saw that was really, really important is women's empowerment. It was the key to positively affecting many aspects of human insecurities: infant mortality, health, lowering fertility rates, participation in social, economic, and political spheres. And when women are educated, they make sure their kids are educated. Education overall is an issue. There was a problem of huge illiteracy. In fact, in Niger, the legislatures, actually the figure that was given, that 75% of the folks in the legislature were illiterate. So they were voting on bills, really, that they couldn't read. But there are very simple educational techniques that can get out there easily through radio that talks about agricultural techniques that would conserve arable land, better nutritious crops, irrigation. In fact, in Djibouti, it was interesting. Just by building girls' latrines near the school, got the girls to school. It was very interesting. Clearly, there needs to be environmental forecasts, looking at short-term and long-term effects, managing water resources, having sustainment strategies as opposed to crisis response. There needs to be a regional perspective, of course, because none of the human insecurities stop at the border. You have to create stakeholders, local stakeholders, local people need to be empowered. It's their choice in terms of the way ahead. I gotta tell you, I met the most inspiring people. Probably the most inspiring person I ever met was the woman who's running all the refugee operations in Chad. Just tremendous. But the NGOs, the host nation, the people, it was just very inspiring to see folks continuing work in very desperate conditions. And so my colleagues and I came up with, we call it the small ball strategy. And we were talking about baseball earlier. In baseball, you don't win by the home run, right? You win by the singles, the bunts, the stolen bases, that type of thing. And the same thing here. To address these kinds of issues, it takes tenacity, perseverance, and small changes over time make a difference. You can't expect overnight changes. At the same time, it does demand tremendous leadership to sustain the political will to carry over the long term. So, that's those were my introduction to human security that I wanted to share with you. It was interesting. I want to turn to the military. And I want to talk a little bit about why it's important for the military to adopt this human security framework. By the way, we can talk about this in the questions and answers. When I, in a uniform, talk about human security, a lot of times I get tomatoes thrown at me, right? Because there's sometimes a visceral reaction about why the military is using this term and why the military is involved in these types of roles and missions. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit in question, in the conversation afterwards. It was interesting because the ideas and concepts of human security, I believe, was really first thought of in the context of Africa. And I soon began to realize why it's important in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while we don't call it human security, we approached Iraq and Afghanistan through counterinsurgency, or the focus on the population fights the threat. And we can talk more about that, but I'm going to offer 10 guiding principles that I think might help the military in terms of the way forward, using or informed by human security. Okay, first, I think human security helps us determine realistic outcomes. And while these outcomes will vary in time and place, failing to establish realistic, achievable ends will result really in unfocused policies and perhaps a loss of political will. It's often understood that our primary national interest is fostering a stable world order. Our national security strategies suggest that encouraging democracy would in fact lessen the prevalence of terrorism. This is what we hope for in Iraq and Afghanistan. What does that mean? Ralph Darndorf talks about stability as the sum of two key components, and that's effectiveness and legitimacy. Effectiveness basically means that the governments have to work. Legitimacy, on the other hand, is a moral concept. It means that governments have to, what they do has to be right. A government is legitimate if what it does is right, both in the sense of complying with certain fundamental principles and in that of being in line with prevailing cultural values. Legitimacy, therefore, must be rooted in the people and not imposed. So what this central concept suggests is that the means of attaining stability is critical and it takes time. Moreover, achievable outcomes must be collaboratively determined, meaning that the United States and the international community must view outcomes empathetically and in partnership with local stakeholders. In other words, there must be an empathetic understanding of the legitimacy formula as well as an understanding of the level of state effectiveness. It's too easy to impose our own views on such matters, and I think a lot of times we do that without even realizing it. Moreover, as the security environment changes, we must be willing to reassess outcomes that are still aligned with our national interest. And a classmate who talked about the fact that in Afghanistan, that there'll be a victory, but it won't be a victory that smells, tastes, or feels like what we would consider a victory. Second, as Tony Blair suggests, the first step in determining whether to intervene anywhere is to diagnose the problem. Key to this process is to understand and value the local perspective. For example, while international terrorism may be a U.S. priority, local terrorism may not be the most pressing security problem for the host nation of people. In many areas that are suffering from grave human insecurities, there are far more pressing issues that affect daily survival. To effectively diagnose the problem, one has to understand that there's often, David Coco Cullen talks about a conflict ecosystem at play. If you don't understand that ecosystem, affecting change in one area may produce unwanted change in another area. Thus, as we think about the dynamic terrorist threat, it is a threat that is set against or exists in that ecosystem. Cullen addresses, for example, many of the differences between the classical insurgent and the modern insurgent, dispelling many assumptions given this complex conflict ecosystem that harbors many different types of groups. So I would say, when you think about human security in this way and diagnosing the problem, it's important to rethink security for whom, from whom, by whom, and with what means. Moreover, a foreign force's presence in a country, just by virtue of being there, changes the security environment. The infrastructure, whether it's roads, bridges, electric grids, that the military provides enables the population and also enables the adversary. And our actions may inadvertently create winners and losers. Even just moving vehicles may disrupt activities. Clearly, the simple acts of showing respect, reciprocity, and trust are extremely important at the individual engagement level, but even such acts grow tired in a country that's occupied by liberators. This empathetic understanding is important. In order to comprehensively understand how to combat terrorism, we should also understand the factors that lead to terrorism's resiliency. As part of our department, we have the Combating Terrorism Center, and their research agenda has really been looking at those factors that feed this idea of resiliency. And we had a report that came out that talked a little bit about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and talked about its unique resiliency mechanisms. And it concluded that common Western assumptions regarding its resiliency consider the source of the resiliency to be a product of a weak Yemeni state and a tribal network that supports the group's existence. However, the report suggests that rather than a weak Yemeni state and a supporting tribal network, the real source of its resiliency is the existence of a core group of leaders, a policy that avoids the indiscriminate killing of civilians, a sophisticated information operations effort, and a coherent strategy with nuanced rhetoric. So while there was much applause for I would say the deaths of al-Awlaki and Samar Khan, that was key to the victories against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the report suggests that our focus on the English-speaking members actually blinded a deeper understanding of what was happening at the local level and how that group traversed those local dynamics. An in-depth look at a different group, the Haqqani network, again reveals the importance of a holistic approach. It's interesting with that as well. The CTC did another report on the Haqqani. In fact, we sent them forward into Afghanistan to do some of this work. But they strove to understand the local, regional, and global perspective and suggest that the counterterrorism community had failed to appreciate those levels of understanding, and that the global character of the Haqqani network and the central role it has played in the evolution of Al-Qaeda was really key to the global jihadi movement. These two examples demonstrate that hard, deliberate, and continuous study is needed to properly diagnose the problem. Guiding principle number 3, you've got to be self-aware. In the fight against Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group, we must also acknowledge that we may inadvertently be acting as the antibiotic, if you will, creating resistant strains of bacteria. Our traditional counterterrorism lens does not account for how we may actually be inadvertently providing the engine of innovation for Al-Qaeda. And if so, how do we respond? How do we become perhaps more networked versus hierarchical so that we can adapt faster? Moreover, it's imperative that our behavior, and I know this resonates especially today after we heard the devastating reports coming out of Afghanistan, but it's imperative that our behavior is guided by our values. Mistreatment or disrespect of local people may fuel insurgents or terrorist groups. In fact, detention centers can have generational effects. And I'll just share a classmate of mine. We graduated during what we now nostalgically refer to as the Cold War. Many of us were assigned to Germany. He talks about that he was a military police officer, that when he was moving into his German landlord's home, you know, the owner came out and basically scolded him for not cleaning up after himself, you know, during the move. And so they got into talking, and Jim, my classmate, said, "Sir, I noticed you speak very, very good English. Where did you learn your English?" And the German landlord said, "Well, I learned it in Louisiana." "What do you mean Louisiana?" "Well, during World War II, I was captured by the Americans in North Africa. I then went to Europe, and then they sent me to Louisiana, and that's where I learned English. And I got to tell you, I was so well taken care of. I was more well taken care of than my own army." And from that day forward, or from that time forward, he was a tremendous American supporter, which really shows the impact that detention centers and the way you treat people can have such an impact for years on afterwards. Fourth, very, very hard, I think we have to acknowledge the difficulty of assessing progress. The complex, uncertain, and unstructured environments present a very challenging landscape to assess progress. And to try and assess progress in terms of legitimacy, very hard to quantify. Assessment relies on qualitative insights of the observer. And many times, progress does not occur in a linear fashion. So an overreaction to backsliding may exacerbate the situation. For example, as a country democratizes and a terrorist group sees a window of opportunity closing, there may actually be a spike in violence. So we saw this actually in the late 70s, early 80s with Spain and ETA, that as Spain was democratizing, ETA's spikes of violence were increasing. Spain continued to adhere to democratic principles and allowed it to contain and marginalize ETA. It's also extremely difficult to assess adversaries, and it does require very hard continuous study. One of our other CTC reports talks about Al-Qaeda by trying to assess 5 dimensions of it in terms of its power to destroy, inspire, power to humiliate, power to command, and power to unify. Very, very difficult. Moreover, Al-Qaeda is very diverse, which allows it to adapt to changing circumstances. And it actually has been a very, I'll call it big tent, allows different viewpoints and different groups of people to enter the Al-Qaeda network. Arguably, it's very difficult to study adversaries because, as Bruce Hoffman notes, all terrorist movements throughout history have presented themselves as monoliths, united and in agreement over fundamental objectives, aims, strategies, tactics, and targets. And too often their opponents succumb to such fiction and therefore fail to seize a critical opportunity to identify and exploit opportunities. This approach of undermining terrorist groups from within, as we find divisions, etc., has arguably been missing from the conduct of war on terrorism. As I mentioned earlier, it's also hard to distinguish between terrorists, bandits, smugglers, thugs, and other illicit activities. Yet by not distinguishing among them, there's a grave risk of applying a strategy that might exacerbate the problem, misunderstand risks, or engage the wrong people. At West Point, we've included this new course, and actually it was the inspiration of one of our junior faculty members, called Winning the Peace. And actually, we held a mini conference, and our folks from the UN, NGOs, combat vets, different disciplines, academic disciplines, we actually hammered out a syllabus that would create perhaps the intellectual tools and how to think about, right, winning the peace. And we were looking for a place to run the capstone exercise. And I have to just confess, I was a little ethnocentric. I'm from New York, so I thought clearly there's probably a place in New York. And then I had a father of one of my former students called, Detective Caggiano, and he says, "Hey, Colonel, come here to Jersey City." I was like, "Jersey City?" He goes, "Yeah, we'll take care of you." So I was like, okay. So we go to, and now we're in our 7th year, this will be 7th or 8th year. We go to Jersey City, in Journal Square area. By the way, I'm a big fan of Jersey City, a terrific city. There's a very vibrant community, the Egyptian immigrant community, Coptic Christians, Muslims, Pakistani, Indians. Actually, we've been embraced by all sections of the city now. We go to the Jewish, the Gospel, the Presbyterian. In fact, if we miss somebody, we usually get a phone call. And we have by the way, the Jersey City Police come along with us. And it's actually been one of those gifts that keep on giving. The police started to understand more about the communities because they sat in the classes. We run now a 2 to 3 day exercise. We sleep in the mosque. We take classes with the imams, and we go to the different cultural and religious sites and learn about it. And actually the relationship It was picked up by international CNN. We had Iraqi delegations come to also talk about what are we doing to have multi-ethnic communities prosper. And actually, if you go to New York City, in the Ground Zero Museum, it's a very sobering museum. It takes you through each the events of that day as they unfolded. The last room in that museum is commemorates all the positive things that have occurred since 9/11. And in that last room, there's a picture of the cadets and the faculty, Jersey City, which I think is a great story. But the reason why I bring this up is because that first time we did this, I remember we were on the 4th floor of this building. We were getting a briefing and a discussion on Coptic Christianity, and we're all huddled together. And of course, it's the first time we're doing this, and we had the police there and whatnot, and everyone's excited. And actually, I felt this person a little bit too close to me, right? And the police were right there. They grabbed him. We're on the 4th floor, mind you. And they basically drag him down the stairs. And you hear all this going on. Meanwhile, the woman's continuing her briefing like nothing's going on. Like, all right. So afterwards, I asked, what happened? Who was this fellow? Of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, this is all an anti-military thing. And, I'm thinking all the worst case, right? And we were told, no, we know this gentleman. When he gets off his meds, he gets a little crazy. We have to grab him. We don't have to put him in the detention cell and just let him wait it out. But it was a great lesson that you really have to know what you're looking at on the ground, because it's very easy to overreact and make things much worse. All right, 5th, we have to capitalize on opportunities. It's very easy. When you're only looking for threats, you miss opportunities. Empowering people through economics has come to the forefront in conflict-prone societies. General David Petraeus identifies money as even more effective than ammunition in the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan when in the right hands. This new dimension of military activity, and we've dubbed it expeditionary economics. You've probably seen it. Carl Schramm has made a splash on expeditionary economics, but suggests that grave human insecurity in many areas is a result of very little effective economic activity. There are some tools that the military has that may actually help it act. I'll give the analogy of a paramedic before the civilian experts are able to assist with long-term economic development. Having said this, it's important to take the time to identify what economy does exist, what is currently being produced, how is it being produced, and who benefits. There may be existing businesses that could be supported, and perhaps even local entrepreneurs. These same observations along social structures, informal leaders, and formal leaders highlight existing power structures that may help with transitional efforts to alleviate human insecurities. Professor Merrill and I were talking earlier about human terrain teams. It was interesting. I had a chance to observe some of the human terrain teams in Iraq. And basically, these are 5-person teams made up of academics and usually reserve military folks who provide cultural knowledge to the brigade combat commander. Very interesting. And a lot of times what they're providing are those folks that the commander should engage or should not engage. But it was interesting. There was one of the team members had told me about how she was able to identify. There was a cleric who was very anti-American in the community, and was using the mosque to talk about some in the Americans in a not good way. She noticed that he seemed to have some commonality with the brigade chaplain, and she got the two of them together, and they really got to know one another. The fact that they were deeply religious and had theological foundation, they got to enjoy one another, and actually it turned where the cleric was then working with helping to set up medical clinics and facilitating those types of relationships. It was a very interesting story. What we've also found through our expeditionary economics work and other research is that women do need to be empowered. I talked about this earlier in the African context, but it cannot be an afterthought, and that's usually how it's discussed. It's got to be integral to any strategy designed to help societies prosper and stabilize. In fact, the UNDP wrote a report, the Arab Development Report. It was written by scholars within the region, that cited the Arab world as suffering from three deficits: the freedom deficit, the women's empowerment deficit, and the human capabilities or knowledge deficit. In several countries in Africa, again, women's empowerment rises to the fore. And I talked about earlier the importance of education and how that affects directly human security factors. Sixth, at the end of the day, there are real trade-offs that must be determined and risks that must be determined. Remember, Leskill, at a more strategic level, talked about international relations, that basically he said international relations is all about making miserable choices. You know, sometimes you just have to make a choice and understand where the trade-offs are. Of course, at the government level, we're looking at trade-offs, right, between liberty and security. Anyone who flew here understands that. The danger, of course, is that governments and societies would lose those values that underpin them if the balance shifts too much one way. When urgent action must be taken, it is easier to operate unilaterally. The trade-off, however, depending on the situation, is the legitimacy of those actions. This is especially a careful consideration for the international coalition as it assists, right, Iraq and Afghanistan and their security forces. The quick solution to what may appear to be an urgent security matter may prompt, for example, a U.S. unit to take unilateral action. But of course, such action may serve to delegitimize the very forces they are charged to assist. Moreover, insurgents and terrorists try to provoke governments to take harsh retaliatory measures through violent actions. The trade-offs, right? Urgency, perhaps, and legitimacy. Of course, the adversary is also making those trade-offs. Right? North Crenshaw distinguishes between terrorists who have an effect in an area and those who are actually successful. And obviously, to understand the difference, you have to understand what their desired outcome is. But we have to distinguish also our own. Are we making an effect, or are we being successful? And this perhaps is the difference or the balance between a quick win in the short term, but realizing that it might undermine a longer-term goal. Seventh, and this goes beyond the military, there needs to be a resizing of the paradigm. What do I mean? Traditionally, we apply military solutions to security problems, especially when we have a narrowed view of security. Of course, the old saying is when all problems are viewed as nails, there's no need to use anything else but a hammer. But as noted earlier, the majority of our security challenges do not cleanly fall within the traditional kinetic category. The human security framework highlights this reality by shedding light on the transnational, multifaceted, multidimensional nature of the security environment. And by seeing this environment, right, more comprehensively in a multidimensional nature, it's imperative that we start reassessing the roles and missions of militaries. How do we bring to bear an integrated approach across all dimensions of power while realizing that the nonlinear, complex nature of the security environment requires overlapping jurisdictions or responsibilities? Secretary Gates so plainly and eloquently states this reality. He said, in recent years, the lines separating war, peace, diplomacy, and development have become more blurred and no longer fit the neat organizational charts of the 20th century. All the various elements and stakeholders working in the international arena, military and civilian, government and private, have learned to stretch outside their comfort zone to work together and achieve results. And of course, no one nation can address the challenges that quite frankly face all of humanity. So the human security approach calls for the sharing of intelligence, of knowledge and perspective in order to facilitate an integrated policy. And one of the challenges, and this is very hard, is to identify early the indicators of terrorism and insurgency, or those opportunities. And by fully diagnosing the problem in context and partnering among agencies internal to the U.S., government, local stakeholders, and the international community, a more cost-effective early approach is much better than waiting until open conflict and war occurs at much greater cost. In other words, we need to rethink the tools to address what has been recognized as a security environment that presents primarily non-military challenges. Right, eighth, the military must be ready for full-spectrum operations in any situation, even within a short span of distance. One local area may require immediate kinetic action, while an adjoining area may require a non-kinetic approach. And given the long-term and short-term uncertainties, the best hedge for now and in the future is confidence across the full spectrum. This combined with the fact that the Army operates in a very decentralized manner, leads to the last two guiding principles on developing aspects of the military profession, both individually and collectively. The last two principles support everything just stated, and there is no substitute for human capital. We must value it, we must invest in it, but what does this mean? The imperative for being able to conduct operations, for example, full spectrum under very uncertain conditions, requires a diverse set of talents that must be valued. So ninth, we must continually professionalize ourselves and assist with professionalizing other militaries. We must ensure that members continue to have experiences, education, and training required to successfully face complex challenges. Second, positive impact that the U.S. military has on professionalizing other militaries should not be underestimated. Some argue that the U.S. military's impact on the Egyptian and Tunisian militaries greatly influenced those militaries' positive response to their societies during the Arab Spring. And again, in Africa, it's interesting that I mentioned the woman who was in charge of all the refugee operations. She said the best thing y'all can do is professionalize the militaries you see here in Africa, because people here have a real fear, rightly so, of the uniform, and professional behavior is what is most important. 10th, we must continue to prepare future leaders both at home and abroad. The challenges facing future leaders require strategic thinkers who, for the military, embrace the warrior ethos and are guided by moral ethical principles. In short, the United States and its allies require leaders of character. And this point may seem self-evident, but it's worth stating explicitly in the midst of budget stringency. And Professor Merrill and I were just talking about that. The current programs at the service academies, the war colleges, ROTC not only educate and develop the U.S. Officer Corps, but their international programs achieve tremendous effects around the world. As our Secretary of Defense recently stated at West Point, we cannot expect our officers to succeed in these environments unless we provide them with the right experiences, education, and incentives. And these incentives and professional requirements must align, I'll call it, with the personnel bureaucracy that manages recruitment, retention, employment, and development. It's very sobering to know that 50 years ago, President Eisenhower remarked, "We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is called for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Such a challenge requires strategic patience, perseverance, and tenacity. When peace-loving nations galvanize their efforts and commitment, much can be done. Freedom prevailed before over such an adversary, and it will again. And I'll say, when the road seems difficult, I find inspiration in the remarks of Nelson Mandela, what he made about his journey when he said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I've taken a moment to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom come responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk has not ended." I'm very honored to be here this evening with y'all to enjoy a moment of reflection and rest here before we continue the journey, not to be deterred by those recurring hills, but rather to be inspired by them. I want to thank you for what you all do. I truly believe that one of the greatest assets our country has is the mutual trust between the military and the society it serves. And I salute you for taking on the challenges that are before us and welcoming the responsibility that freedom incurs. Thank you. No one asks a question, he's got the first one. So,
provided treatment from the host state and also just the circumstances they find themselves in. And quantitatively, we found a relationship between refugees and the onset of terrorism in the host country. But I was wondering, either from your experience or from, theoretically, if you would see refugees as a potential source of recruitment for terrorist organizations, or it's just on its own.
No, great question. Sounds like a great study that you're doing. I think each situation has to be studied in context. And you have to understand. Can you hear me, or do I need to go here? Can you hear? All right. Tell you what, make this cozy. But I think when you look at it, you've got to look at it in context. So why are there refugees, for example? There's, environmental refugees. Environmental refugees don't go home, right? There's, that's a whole other dimension. When we saw the refugees in Chad, it was interesting. I didn't have the pictures, but the makeshift shelters, right, for the refugees were very makeshift, very temporary, very basic, sanitation, very, very basic, right? In fact, what the UNHCR, the director had told me is that they had to make sure, right, that they had the refugees in their different ethnic groups so they can continue to live as normal as possible. But part of the problem is when you start building permanent, good facilities, no one's going home, right? So it's a very tough situation. When I was there, they said, we don't think anyone's leaving for the next 7 years, okay? Actually, and now, in fact, I still read that they're still there, even though we hear sometimes up and down about what's going on in Sudan. So what does that mean? It does present very vulnerable populations. And in that situation, what the UN had to do was expand its charter and provide some of the aid for the surrounding villages. Because can you imagine being in one of those villages and you see the aid trucks going by, passing you by, right? And so then you can get some resentment stored up. There was some resentment that occurred, for example, this is a little bit off, but from the refugee camps, when we helped seal the border between Libya and Chad to prevent smuggling. But what did that also do? It prevented folks who had their livelihood depending on that cross-border movement. This gets back to that strategic thinking. What are the second, third order effects of what we're doing before we start slopping, putting 20,000 people on a very tough environment, if you will, just in terms of land, water, etc. And in many of these environments, quite frankly, when we talk about economic activity, there was a gentleman right outside the city, that's called the town that's near the refugee camps, that has a PhD from Arizona University, actually, and he was growing watermelons, and they were excellent. The problem is there's no infrastructure to get the watermelons to market. And these are the types of environments, right, that a lot of refugees find themselves. So does that mean automatically they turn to terrorism? If the state can't provide social services, maybe they'll go to a group that provides social services. And sometimes that group, particularly, does come from a terrorist organization. There's also the backlash. I talked about the cross-border between Niger and Nigeria, right? There was also a backlash that a lot of some of the ethnic groups along the border were very much resenting the fact that their radical groups were telling them how to dress, how to pray, and there was a backlash against that as well. So it's not preordained that that's going to happen. But is that a very vulnerable situation? Yes, right? When people are truly suffering and are really at the mercy of others for basic survival. Yes.
My name is Jonathan Hart, and I study at BYU Political Science. And you talked earlier about desertification in Chad. And what is the military doing to either prepare for environmental issues like that or prevent them, different things like that?
That's a great question. One is perhaps even just anticipating conflict, right? So you talk about water. There's going to, in fact, I think right here, I understand that you're worried about the drought, right? Water for next year. I mean, this is a real issue, not just in underdeveloped But I think there's a call that perhaps the military may need to think about goals and missions in terms of perhaps environmental monitoring. You know, if we're anticipating more natural disasters because of what we're seeing in the environment, that's another, right, to help with those types of situations. It could be, you know, Michael Clare talks about gas pipelines, right? It's a different type of resource, but gas pipelines that are going to go more and more inland, and that maybe we're going to be guarding pipelines. I mean, but to try and anticipate if these are the sources of conflict, what should be the role of the military? And how do we partner with NGOs, local governments, et cetera? And I'll tell you, we had a very interesting conference at West Point that talked about the military and NGOs working together. Not everybody wants that to happen, for many, you know, for good reasons. There are NGOs that really rely on the fact that they must remain neutral, independent, and that they're there purely for humanitarian reasons. And as a military, you have to respect that. And so a lot of what we talked about through that conference was, well, at least we should share some information so that we're not undermining perhaps some of these things. But I think that might be something in the conference. I'd be curious to hear what you all think about. If these type of security issues are on the forefront, what do you expect your military to do? You know, in terms of these types of issues, and maybe it's a rethinking a little bit. You know, maybe we're looking at getting rid of landmines, or maybe we're looking at you know, securing certain resources. Maybe there's a great opportunity. There are a lot of folks who've done some environmental studies that talk about opportunities because for cooperation, when there's common cause for folks to cooperate because they're all going to benefit from that. So, yeah. Yes.
Andrew Howard, I say at BYU. A lot of my research over the past few semesters has been empowering women in fact, and how we can solve that, in particular military problems in women's health. But through your travels and studies, especially from a military perspective, what are the biggest issues to you in empowering women, and what would you recommend is this policy needs to change to implement that?
So that's a great question. And sometimes I get, I'll be always totally honest, but I get a little frustrated, right, when we hear about some, if you want to talk about even mutilation, right, that occurs in some cultures. And we're told, oh, it's culturally, you can't touch that because it's part of the culture. Yet if that was happening to an ethnic group, right, there'd be an uproar. It's very interesting to me. So in my head, I had to try and, I can't reconcile that. I'll be honest with that. But I think there are many ways. In fact, with the human terrain teams, we found it was very important to have a woman on a human terrain team. And actually, there are now female engagement teams that actually, in fact, I worked with the volleyball team at West Point. And the captain of the volleyball team a couple of years ago, she graduated, she was part of the female engagement team that air assaulted with the 101st into Afghanistan. And her job was to particularly work with the women. And you can learn a lot, actually. It's good intel on one hand, but then you can find out what are the real issues that are going on and how do we address that. So even just having women in the area to help collect some of that information. But how do you empower women? I know that talking to some members of the NGOs, they say actually when you work with the women who are doing a lot of the work, quite frankly, whether it's agriculturally, rearing kids, etc., that when you introduce new techniques or education, that you do see an impact, you see an effect that occurs. And quite, some of the studies that have been done, like UNDP's, the Arab report that I had mentioned earlier, getting that out is very important. Understanding the culture, I mentioned just putting in latrines. You would think at a school, by that alone, doubled the amount of girls who went to class. So there are little things, and I think that's sort of the hard part with this whole field, is that there's not one big thing. It's everyone working together and figuring out what works in one context, what works in another context, and just the tenacity to keep going, I think, is really the challenge. Because a lot of what we're talking about, especially when we talk about the importance of education, that doesn't happen overnight, but it catches on. So if I had to, the education piece, I would say, is huge when you're talking about women's empowerment.
Cindy, would you let me impose on your time for just a minute on this subject of empowering women? There may not be many things admirable about Mao Zedong, but he had hold of fundamental truth when he observed that the women hold up half the heavens. And so he formed the All China Women's Federation. Latter-day Saints tend to think that their Relief Society is the world's biggest women's organization. It has probably 2, 3, 4 million people in it. It has 200 or 300, 400 million women in the All China Women's Federation, which branches down through province and district and city, and they have orphanages, schools, farms. They are a viable part of the Chinese society and economy, and sort of remarkable contrast to the Arab world, which forgoes half of its human capital, and is one of the reasons why China has been flourishing and the Arab world has been moving the other way.
Well, do you think there's a negative effect? Oh, my name is Alejandro. I go to WIAC. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Do you think there's a negative effect with policies like in New York City with the tapping on following of Muslims through the state? How the military deals with stuff like that, political decisions?
So how the military deals with what the police do?
Yeah. Is there a negative effect, and do you think?
You know, it's interesting because news travels, right? So does it have an effect? Maybe I don't know. I don't know how that plays maybe abroad in what we're doing in Afghanistan or Iraq or that matter anywhere around the world. However, I will say this. I think the one piece that we have to really, really get right is how we handle at home the threat, that we don't unravel the fabric of who we are as a nation, and that we need to ensure that we continue. I mean, the strength of our nation is the diversity of our nation. And quite frankly, in one sense, I'm very happy that we haven't seen more domestic terrorism as a backlash, but definitely we've got to be very careful how we proceed, and that we're rule of law, and that we don't just overstep, right? And because I do believe, with everything, quite frankly, with everything, whether it's an organization, a country, relationships, trust is the glue, right? And we cannot do anything to really break that trust with citizens, with each other, when we're working with other nations, etc. That trust is so, so important. I can't speak specifically on the NYPD because I don't know in terms of what its, the procedures it followed, etc. So I won't comment on that, but clearly they're, and every time we go to Jersey City, by the way, they're very attuned. And so we hear, in fact, when, I'm going to forget her name, the communicator for President Bush, Karen Hughes. Remember when she went to the Middle East to tell, and she went and spoke to the women there and said, oh, I'm so happy, how did she put it? I feel terrible that you're all so unhappy. As soon as we walked into the mosque in Jersey City, all the women came and fell on us and said, we're not even happy, we're very happy. You know, so we do have to be careful in how we express ourselves because it plays differently to different groups of folks. And I think that gets to the importance of education, right, when we're addressing issues. Yes?
My name is Joel. I'm studying public health at WIAC. You mentioned how trust is the glue. With the incident that just happened in Afghanistan, what should be the first step to regain that trust? Or,
yeah, that's going to be tough, right? So the key, I obviously to assisting with security forces is the trust as partners. And I will tell you, it's been, I know you're going to hear from Dr. Nagel tomorrow. We'll probably touch on this directly. One of the things I found overall in how we proceeded with our assistance with Afghanistan as partners is that part of it is, I think, being sensitive to our own culture, right? So the military culture in particular, but the American culture, we like to see immediate results, right? Some of the trade-offs that I talk about, we like to see immediate results. And when we don't see those results, even though we're trying to empower the Afghans, right, to do these things, there's like this uncomfortable space where nothing's getting done. And we're not comfortable, right, with that uncomfortable space. We like to rush in and do it ourselves, right? When we rush in and do it ourselves, we're not, I think, perhaps reflecting that trust that we're definitely not building capacity so that when we leave, that they're able to do that. So those are some of the issues, the challenges that we've dealt with. I think with something, with what happened, and actually Dr. Nagel, I think was on NPR this morning and talked about this a little bit in terms of the Koran burning was more of an issue. And when, this is going to sound horrible when I say this, but this is an incident that is not totally unique in terms of Afghans' experience with the military, okay, with some military operations. Now, it's totally devastating, right, that we have a soldier who we don't know, and I'm not going to speculate why he did what he did. Obviously, there is no reason for why he did what he did. It's just awful. I think the best thing we can do is be as transparent as possible as we go through the investigation. I think we have to hold folks accountable, and we've got to understand, and I know we're hearing through the news, and I'm not an expert on this, but we're hearing through the news that he had been suffering from head injuries, and that has been actually a tough thing for the military in terms of acknowledging head injuries, treating head injuries properly, etc. And I think you're going to see some of that. So the best thing we can do, quite frankly, is be transparent, hold folks accountable, be thorough, and we need to go forward. This, of course, makes it very difficult for the young men and women out there who are trying to do their job right in the midst of this as well. So just a terrible, devastating blow. Yes.
I'm Peter Carroll at State Local Science and WIAC. You mentioned the connection between state stability and legitimacy and human security.
Yes.
In states where state stability seems a long way off, are there other causes of human security that you've seen in your research or experience? Are there other causes of human security besides like state stability?
That enhances human security but don't have state stability? Yeah. That's a great question. I like Ralph Dorndorf, how he thinks about stability in terms of effectiveness and legitimacy. And I think actually that's a good way to think as we just saw the Arab Spring, and I guess it's still, we're still calling it the Arab Spring, but in terms of how we think about stability. Michael Ignatieff actually had written a piece in the Journal of Dissent actually that talks through this a little bit in terms of what happens, what's worse, right, if you have a government that can't govern or a tyrant, in terms of the effects that may have. So I think a couple of things. When you think of state stability, again, I think we're using it in our head, and that goes to the Afghan outcome, right? We have in our head what a state should be able to do. That's perhaps our perception, right? What other states that are just getting their legs, if you will, under them, some of the state effectiveness, maybe they don't need that bar, and the expectations from the people are not that high. And it doesn't have to be this high, initially, especially as they're going through transitions, etc., which I think is really, really important. Of course, the international community has organizations that provide some services that can alleviate some human security. Local NGOs have some some capacity, right? We see that. If it's a community that has a civil society, you know, there's some elements of civil society that can help. You know, in really bad times, ethnic groups tend to come together to provide support. That might be another piece. But you know, you can argue that the nation state, some people call this the post-Westphalian world, that maybe there are some capacities that are no longer resident in a nation state that need to go outside. So now you have regional organizations like the African Union, of course we know the European Union, and there are capacities maybe that need to be at a very local level, that need to be at a very decentralized level. So I think part of understanding the issues is also understanding who should best deliver it and at what level. That's a good question.
One more. My name is Malcolm Cullen. I'm studying political science at WIAC. And a minute ago you mentioned, you know, our desire to get in there and write things quickly and to take action, and then it kind of has some negative potential negative consequences. How do you balance that with a lack of activity, you know, maybe seeing as lack of caring, or in a situation where we could have done something when we didn't because we were afraid of taking consequences of the action, right?
Yeah, so I think, and that's a great question. So I go back to diagnose the problem. What's going on? And it's interesting with the human training piece, looking at those teams. The commanders who valued cultural knowledge really talked about the fact that they were able to have much less effectiveness but success, because while they might not have taken kinetic action, sometimes when you think of action, you think about action, you know, as opposed to what are the dynamics going on? Who should I talk to? Who are the elders I need to pull together? What kind of economic activities can we perhaps facilitate? You know, these types of questions that maybe are not the glamorous type of issues, but you have to roll up your sleeves and really dive into it. It was interesting. I had a friend of mine actually played football in the Army. We went to school together, and I saw him actually, so it was at a graduation years later, and he said, "I'm going to call you if I need anything." I'm like, "Go ahead." I got a call. And he said, "You know what, I just gave up my field artillery brigade." This is in the MND North, the division in Northern Iraq. And he said, "I just gave up my field artillery brigade, and I'm now the chief of the FEC, which I'm going to forget for a moment, the Fire Effects Coordination Cell. And really what I'm supposed to be doing is analyzing political and economic effects and doing that kind of analysis." And he said, "Oh my gosh." So a couple of us went out during spring break, actually, to do sort of an analysis of what's going on. And what we noticed is, you know, an intelligence officer, an intelligence officer by trade, as well as Suzanne Nielsen, who will be here for the next several days. But you always do an intelligence preparation by the battlefield, right? So you want to know what's out there, what's the key terrain, the avenues of approach, these types of things, very traditional. What we need now, and what we didn't see, are like overlays that then say, okay, what's the economic activity? Where are the value chains? You know, where's the road network? You know, who are the political informal leaders? You know, what does the society, the informal society look like? Those are the kinds of things that need hard study, so that maybe you don't need to take lethal action. You can do non-lethal action that actually will provide the kind of mission success that you're there in the first place, which is to, if you talk about stabilize, right, to bring legitimacy and effectiveness and whatnot. So I don't know if that addresses your question. I think sometimes we think we got to be out, we got to, you know, be kicking indoors and shooting and whatnot, and that's the action we need to do. Whereas no, it might be the more tedious, if you want to think of it that way, or hard study, roll up your sleeves, and let's really start looking at the dynamics and what can we leverage and capitalize on, and et cetera. And sometimes in partnership, sometimes you have to do both. So.
Thank you.
time. There's a story that's this is a chop piece by, there's a story with it which we'll send to you when we send this. We won't ask you to take it home with you, but we'd like to have that as a memorial of your visit here.
This is very, very special. Let me just say, I so applaud what you're doing. Our nation really depends on you, on the future leaders who are going to work together in whatever capacity, in the private sector, in the public sector, in the military, government, whatever it is. And I just want to thank you for all that you're doing, for the hard study that you're doing, for taking the time, investing in time here. And I can just tell you that I'm very, very hopeful for the future. So this has been a great, great honor. Sir, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.